Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is a bit puzzling and gives possibly more questions than answers. Story is titled, Not Sure If It Was a Wendigo, but Something Odd Happened. When I was 8 years old, both of my parents worked full time. My dad was predominantly on third shift at his job, and my mum was an elementary school teacher. We lived literally right up the road from the grandparents in a very small town. It was getting close to my 9th birthday when I contracted strep throat and scarlet fever. I was severely sick, could barely speak, had the first case of the cold sweats that I remember in my entire life. I could barely pull myself out of bed to even use the restroom. I was absolutely miserable, and of course, being as young as I was, I didn't take the pain very well. My poor mother was at a loss as what to do with her working and my dad needing to use daylight hours to sleep. The first day I was sick, perhaps it was a Tuesday. My birthday would fall on a Friday. My dad stayed up most of the day with me, made me food, let me sleep on his lap on the couch, wiped my forehead down, and made sure I took my medicine, etc. But on the second day, my grandmother had called and offered to let me stay at her house so my dad could get some sleep. He said yes and woke me up around 7 that morning to drive me up to her home. My grandfather also worked at this time, so he was already gone when we arrived. I don't remember too much of the early morning. I probably just slept in my grandmother's bed, tossing and turning, when I'd wake up feeling extra bad. She encouraged me to swallow my awful tasting medicine, a little more gently than my dad did, of course. She did fix me some tomato soup to try and eat, and it was the first time since I'd gotten sick that I had an appetite. I should mention my grandmother had this cute Yorkshire Terrier named Samson. He was a very docile, not like the usual annoying, barking all the time type terriers. Samson came into the room and curled up next to me as I dozed. I do not know when I woke up, but at some point it had to be the early afternoon lunchtime because I could hear the TV faintly from the living room on some game show. My grandmother had a ritual of eating her lunch while watching a game show. I think it was The Price is Right. I was trying to fall back asleep because I'd gotten this really bad headache, maybe from dehydration. I was on the verge of sleep when I jolted awake by the Samson yelp that erupted from the living room. The terrier curled up next to my feet perked up, but didn't move. I knew I'd heard his name being called too, but it was odd. He didn't respond. Samson, my grandmother called again. Samson, Samson. The dog still didn't run out of the room to her. I was confused. As he was so obedient to my grandmother, he was almost frozen, staring at the cracked open door but making no attempt to go to her. She called Samson maybe 3 or 4 more times, then I got annoyed. I remember flinging the covers off of me, and of course my clothes are sticky with sweat, and I just generally feel uncomfortable and groggy. I stumble out of the room, wiping my eyes, asking, Grandma, do you need Samson? He's in the room with me. I'm in the living room and I have to do a double take. The TV is still on and blaring. There's a bowl of soup sitting on the coffee table and an open Pepsi next to it. But my grandmother isn't anywhere in the room. Maybe she's in the bathroom. I crossed the room and went past the kitchen. Empty too. I got to the bathroom door, which was shut, and knocked. Nothing. I then opened it. No one was in there. The house was empty. It's not a huge house either. I've covered all of the rooms. So yes, my first reaction was to get scared. I could clearly hear my grandmother calling for the dog, but she was not anywhere inside. I could feel my hands and my feet get all tingly. I started to shout for my grandmother, but my voice is just echoing through the small cramped home. Samson had gotten up at this point and was sitting near the couch, looking completely undisturbed. I fumbled for the remote and turned the TV off and yelled, more like wheezed, to the top of my lungs, which you can imagine how painful this was with the scratchy, infected throat. Grandma! The worst part happened next. I hear her shouting my name back, clear as ever, like she was standing only feet away. I start crying now, scared out of my mind. I feel like maybe it has to be a ghost. I grew up with scary ghost stories courtesy of my dad, and I'm convinced now I'm in the room with a ghost. And then she, whatever this was, proceeded to call my name again. Then there was a second voice. Definitely not my grandmother's. It was deeper, definitely more masculine, and absolutely terrifying as it shouted, "Come to the front door." I did not do that. Instead, I made sure to run back to my grandparents' bedroom, lock the door, and pick up the telephone on the nightstand. I called my own home phone, and my dad's sleepy voice answered. Through a barely comprehensible voice, I managed to croak something like, "Daddy, there's something in the house, and I can't find Grandma. She's gone." My dad, of course, said he jumped out of bed, grabbed his Swiss Army knife he kept in a drawer next to the bed, and ran down the road to the house in his PJs and bare feet. He ran up to the front door, jiggled the handle. It was locked. So he made his way around, and since he knew the garage code, just punched it in and got inside. A quick sweep of the 3 rooms of the home showed no one was there. It's not like there was really anywhere to hide. I ran out of the room once I was sure he was there and began bawling in his arms. He kept reassuring me there was no one here, and then asked if I did not know where Grandma was and if she'd left a note. I said I hadn't, and explained I'd woken up to her calling for Samson, but she hadn't been anywhere there. This was back when cell phones were definitely around, but there were no iPhones, and my grandparents certainly wouldn't have been buying them anyway. My dad had one, but not on him at the time. I could tell he was trying to keep calm, so he just said we would need to go back to our house. I was sure he was probably going to call the police at the point, just because my grandma still hadn't popped up and her car had been in the garage when he got in. If she had left, she'd gone on foot. We hadn't even made 2 steps out of the driveway when my grandma's neighbour's house. My grandma was strolling out, chatting to the neighbour. She saw my dad and then me, crying my eyes out, and immediately ran over to see what was wrong. She was super apologetic. She said she stepped out right when she heated up her soup to go see her neighbour, who called about looking at something my grandma was going to buy. My grandma had figured I was asleep and she'd only been gone for 10 or 15 minutes. At first, people may have assumed I was feverish, therefore delusional, but I still stand by what happened. I know for a fact I was definitely alone in the house, safe for Samson, but the voices I heard were real. For a while, I was hesitant to go back into my grandma's house, because this happened in the middle of the day. I later read stories at school about Wendigos, or creatures that would disguise their voices to lure people. This was the closest explanation I could ever get from about what I heard. I never shared to anyone that I thought it was for sure a Wendigo, and chalked it up maybe to be just a ghost. I'm close to my 20s now. Last year was the first time I shared this story fully to my grandpa, who used to just say their fever must have made me have bad dreams. We were sitting on the front porch of the house, smoking cigarettes and exchanging anecdotes. When I finished telling him for the first time, he looked sort of disturbed about it. He finally put his cigarette out and just stared out into the road. Then he cleared his throat and looked over at me. "You know," he said slowly, "some funny things used to happen around that time. In the middle of the night, I'd wake up to take a piss or something. When I'd first sit up in bed, I could hear your grandma sleeping away, snoring." He chuckled, but his face grew serious again. "Anyways, I'd always hear her calling for the dog." I tried to remain looking calm, but my voice still shook when I asked him, "Even when she was sleeping? Sleep talking?" "No." He shook his head. "I heard her calling from outside, maybe the living room. I don't know, honey. She'd call for the dog. She'd call my name, all while she was really sleeping next to me, sleeping like a baby." "Have you ever told anyone?" "No. I don't want to scare her. She's real scared of the ideas of like ghosts and stuff. That's why when you were younger and that thing happened, I told her just to remember you'd been sick, fever and all. Probably having nightmares." He looked gravely at me. "Don't repeat this to her, please, honey. She's really not the type to be scaring." Of course, I wanted to cry. I had this itchy, creepy feeling suddenly about being at the house. "Grandpa, do you still hear it sometimes?" "Oh, yes." He was now reaching into his breast pocket to get out another cigarette. "Every night. But you just gotta remember not to do what it says. Even the dog figured it out. If it says to come to the door, you stay away from the door. If it says, I don't know, come here, you just stay still in the room until it quits calling." And with that, he asked to borrow my lighter again. Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is a bit puzzling and gives possibly more questions than answers. Story is titled, Not Sure If It Was a Wendigo,